Before we look at the world of John Gnagy, the exhibit hanging here, I think it appropriate to talk a little bit about where it is and why it's here. The John Gnagy exhibit, which has been here during most of the month of April and now early in May 1987, really is a very appropriate time for being here. You see, Johnny, my father, died about 6 years ago, and 2 years later, Mary Jo died. Until after that, I had no way to decide, or any really opportunity or time to decide about what to do with Johnny's many pieces of art, which were packed up and brought here to Florida after he died from California. Prior to that, and since that time, I've been active in the Maitland Art Center, which is a fascinating place, and one which I feel increasingly is appropriate for this exhibit and appropriate to the kinds of things both John and Mary Jo were interested in. It's a very old, by Florida standards, complex, designed entirely in the first place for the arts and artists. It is now almost 50 years old, and it is the product of the mind of one wonderful, eccentric, delightful, creative man named Andre Smith. I guess those adjectives could describe John Gnagy too, although they expressed their interests in quite different ways. Andre Smith built the 17 buildings in this complex one at a time over a period of about 10 years. He intended it to be a place where he could come to work and where in fact he could encourage other artists to come by invitation, 2 or 3 at a time during the winters, to be in a very quiet and creative atmosphere and to paint or sculpt or draw or do printmaking. Over a period of a number of years, in fact, a great many artists did come, many of them who have become quite well known as American artists of the 20th century. The story of the recovery and restoration of the Maitland Art Center is a story in itself, and that's a story for another time. But I have become very interested in, very admiring of this place and of the mind that created it, as well as the people who are now working so hard to make it an operative center. It is in the process of completion of restoration, and it is a very active and a very wonderful place. It has a small gallery of 4 rooms, and that's where we will find the John Gnagy exhibit in a very short time. I want also to have you meet Jerry Shep, the current director of the Maitland Art Center. Jerry himself is one of the reasons for my being here and for the John Gnagy show being here right now.
Us until May 10th.
The poster for the world of John Gnagy is a particular pleasure for me to have had a hand in, because of course it shows one of John's best and most well-known paintings. It is also a kind of example of a lot of the things that he liked about his own work and that other people have enjoyed. It's a great study in color. It involves a lot of his own study of form, shadow, reflection, and color mixing. So I chose that to make a poster, and that indeed proved to be a very interesting project, simply because, having been active in various phases of the arts here in Central Florida, a number of friends helped me with the project. A very good friend, Barbara Tiffany, did the graphic work on the poster. Another friend at a lithograph company did the printing and asked me to come and help with the color work at the very end as we went to press, which was very interesting. He also helped me select the paper. I have had the encouragement and the interest of a great number of people throughout the exhibit, but the poster, I think, is a particularly nice example of those coming together of friends and artists. The first room in the exhibit is hung in a way that indicates the various media that John Gnagy was proficient in. It is a mixture, therefore, of various types of drawings and paintings, and various sizes and various chronological dates. dates in his career. We have all through his work an indication of his great enjoyment of the outdoors. Many of his paintings are of nature and natural things. This one is from a fishing trip, this little gouache here. And over here we have a desert scene, a very lovely windswept smoke tree in the desert. And on this wall, one of his later pieces, which indicate his particular interest in the psycho-symbolic. It was painted after the death of Louis Armstrong, and it shows how much John felt strongly about Louis Armstrong's music, his jazz, trumpet, and his spirituality. So it is a good-humored, but still very sensitive view of Louis Armstrong playing his horn in heaven and raising the spirits right out of the graveyard. All by itself on this wall, you'll see the Moon and Grapes, the original from which the poster was taken. It glows indeed, and I have always had it hanging since it's been mine, where we can all see it all the time. I think the family is generally agreed that this is one of John's very finest works. It's interesting to note that that is a watercolor on a panel with an oil glaze, which is unusual. It looks more as though it were an oil painting itself. He was experimenting with color at the time, and color mixing was done very carefully. He worked on this painting for a period of 2 or 3 years. The small fish on this wall is an example of a number which I own, and 3 or 4 of them are hung, some in the other room. But here you'll see a bass done on scratchboard. The interesting thing about this piece is that it was done with a very refined technique, not even much in use now, whereby the artist blacks out the area to be painted or depicted and then scratches away what will be white. It's a reverse process, and Johnny always called this a scratchboard etching, which in effect it really is. He did a number of these, some of which were published in fishing magazines, and because they were, copper plates were made of those drawings. I have framed several of them with the plates, which I think makes a very handsome and effective piece. Now we continue on with his great fishing penchant. And I should indicate that although most of you could tell this right away, it is Johnny himself fishing underwater for a golden grouper. He took an expedition just to search for a golden grouper, which he needed to have for a specimen for some of the other paintings he was doing. And they're very hard to find and very hard to catch. So with great delight, he discovered that once he had found the golden grouper, the easiest thing to lure it was to get under the water, see where it was, then rise above the water with his regular casting rod and cast toward the fish, then get down again underwater and hook the fish that way where he could see what he was doing. He did land the golden grouper, and no one was ever more delighted about anything than Johnny was after that great fishing expedition. He was so delighted, in fact, that he wrote an article for True magazine, which I also have, and made this the illustration. Now here we have what John himself considered his major piece of work. It's interesting to me because although it was a great favorite of many people's, I don't think it was of my mother's favorite, and I think perhaps it is very close to the Moon and Grapes in my own view, but perhaps not my favorite. He also painted this quite early in his career, and it, like many of his other pieces, is reminiscent of his boyhood in Kansas. Later on, in fact, as he was writing some things about his own life, he called himself the blacksmith of American art. He looked on himself, you see, as more a craftsman than a creator. And it's also interesting to notice that once he found a theme that he liked, a composition that he enjoyed, he would repeat it in other media. So these 3 are hung together to show that particular talent of his. He did at one time a lithograph of the same composition, and then later a scratchboard of it, which I have had framed, and then they were hung together. As we go into the second room, we'll find quite a different series of pieces. Some of which I have had framed for this occasion because I don't know whether Johnny even considered them very important. This one, in fact, was taken from a portfolio and I think looks wonderful now that it has been made a little more respectable. It's a wash painting of a canoe on the canal in New Hope and was done approximately 1939 or 40. So it is one of the earlier pieces in this exhibit. Next door to it is another backyard scene, very similarly painted, of the same general neighborhood in New Hope, where I grew up and where John did so much of his early work. Again, moving into the various versatility of John Gnagy's talent, we see the 4 lithographs he did much later in his life. These were done in 1962 and 63 as a commission for a bank in California. And they were hand lithographed by a great friend of his whose name was Werner Fugue, who was a fine lithographer. They were a limited edition of 200 of each of these, many of which have been sold. But they, because they were done in California, represent various desert scenes, both in the mountains and down on the floor of the desert near where John and Mary Jo were living at the time. This is one of my favorites, in fact. This one is called Manzanita, and John understood and knew how to depict the twisted trees that grew so frequently, both in the desert and up in the mountain where he and Mary Jo lived for 20 years. Although these have not been sold in a series very often, I have found that about the same number of each of them have been sold. So I think in the public's view, they are equally interesting. As I've said, both Manzanita and this one, Pinyon Pine, are among my favorites. But perhaps that's because they seem to me so much like Idlewild itself. We move back again to another medium and to an earlier place. This was a painting I call Bowman's Hill, and it was done from Bowman's Hill Tower, in fact, just below New Hope, looking out north on the Delaware River. I remember very often going on picnics with Johnny and Mary Jo and my brother Steve. It was a very special treat to do that because climbing the hill and then climbing the tower were a great family fun. Bowman's Hill does command a wonderful view of the Delaware, and if you're interested, you might be glad to know that it was placed there as a watchtower during the Revolution. This is a very fine little drawing, which I believe was a study for a painting never painted, but done on a fine sandpaper with a very soft pencil. The scene is from one of the Gulf of off the coast of Baja, Mexico, where John and Mary Jo very often went on collecting and fishing trips. It's a lovely little drawing, and again looks much better since it was framed. It was one of those pieces put away in a portfolio, and now that it's looking so handsome, I decided I like it very much. If I have any favorite at all, though, I think it perhaps is this painting of John's, and it's not typical of many of his other pieces, but I think it indicates again his tremendous interest in the science of color, in the excitement of color, and in the visual impact of color. This painting was done in 1937 or 8, and it is the corner of a room with a big potted fern sitting in the corner of it. It's been likened to early pieces by David Hockney, and I think that indeed is quite a compliment, but it does indicate the tremendous interest in semi-abstract painting and in color. Not very long ago, as I was getting ready for this exhibit, I discovered to my great interest that some of these areas have been penciled in with the colors that in fact were put there. So he did this, I think, as a kind of study and worked it out, although it's a very spontaneous painting. He was doing the study of color, and so here you have bright orange. Up here you have green, which he then changed his mind about. And let me see, there's one other place where I found buried under the paint a color indication. So it must have been not intended as a finished painting, but I think it's, for me, one of his very nicest. And now we see one of the later pieces that Johnny did, and again, it was a very interesting and a very different technique. Believe it or not, this was done with powdered oils on a paper surface, a fiber surface, which was later glazed after it had been blended and completed, which was later glazed with acrylic, which makes it very impervious to most damage. He was working with this technique for about 10 years, maybe a little longer, in order to try to develop a way to go to teach on television once color had come into being. He, of course, during his great days with television, was teaching on black and white television and demonstrating in black and white. As color overtook the black and white medium, John was not able to do what he considered an effective lesson in as short a time as 15 minutes in color, because of course that is more complex and very difficult to teach. He never was back on television, but many of the pieces you will see were in fact done as rehearsal drawings and paintings with the hopeful purpose that they would eventually form color lessons. Two outstanding oil paintings that Johnny did, again fairly early, were part of a series that were proposed and never completed because, like many other artists, he became distracted and interested in other new ideas and other new media and moved on. These two, again, hark back to his youthful days in Kansas. This one is called Metamorphosis and is pretty clear in its meaning. It's, of course, a butterfly with a caterpillar near it, and the cycle of life is further indicated by the clover and the grasses, and then in the background, the cemetery and the small country church. If you haven't noticed it already, and perhaps you can't see it now, he whimsically put his name, John, on the foremost tombstone right under the caterpillar. And I think that, along with some other paintings like this, indicate his own sense of the earth and the return to the earth. It was whimsy, but it was also spiritual. And again, the corn ripening in the field. With the mist, the hazy mist of late summer hanging over the Kansas plains, I think is very indicative of Johnny's childhood. And I find it particularly interesting, along with Metamorphosis, because of its point of view. He was very interested in composition, effective composition, and here you have two very strong foreground compositions, this one quite vertical, and then a receding background with a very low horizon and a large sky. So in effect, he was looking at it from the point of view of either a child or possibly a corn worm, or over here, the caterpillar himself. One of the many seascapes that John did over the years is depicted here, and you can see the stunted cypress on that piece of land jutting out on the right. He was very interested in tide pools, in surf fishing, and of course in the ocean itself. He was, being a Kansas boy, I think the ocean meant a particular lot to him, just because he was denied access to it for 20 years of his life. And once he discovered it, he always wanted to be near the sea. Early on in his career in New York, John was working in another medium, and this one is, I think, a very charming painting. Others admire it as much as I believe. It will, in fact, be in Sam and Julie's house one day, because it shows Central Park, one of the bridges over the pond or stream in Central Park. He did this with watercolor and pen, and it's a very light, simple piece, probably quickly done, but it's done with great mastery of that medium as well. Yet another seascape is of particular interest, and I'm glad to have it here because this is a painting that Johnny gave to Mary Jo on their 50th wedding anniversary. it meant a great deal to both of them to have spent so much time together fishing and traveling on the ocean. The low-lying hills in the back, I'm almost sure, are the Baja off the coast of California, which is in Mexico, and they had spent many happy expeditions down in that region. You can see again his great mastery with this new medium he really invented of pastel oils laid on with a stump, not a brush, but he still has that motion of the water and that wonderful sweep of the sky. This case is all fish and fishing, and you'll notice in the center of it the illustration for that fishing expedition for the golden grouper in the magazine called True, which was published, I believe, in 1959. He was very careful about the way in which he depicted fish. He did fish illustrations as carefully as he did all his other work, and as truthfully. So aside from the collecting, he would then do quick sketches at the moment he brought them aboard or ashore. Later he would do small paintings. This is a very interesting example of 6 different small perches, not finished, but quickly captured so the colors would be on paper before they faded. He was very concerned about losing the fish, because after an hour even the fish are no longer as brilliant. Several of those illustrations were used in the Pacific Guide to Fishes, which was one of the Peterson Field Guide series. And here we have a couple of sketches, this one for a television show, a lesson that included some fish, and here again an action scene of a fish jumping at night with a fisherman in the foreground. These sketches are all really designed to show his ability to portray action through the basic forms that he used in teaching, and which he believed in very deeply from the time he was a very young man: the cone, the cube, the ball, and the cylinder. You can see that the horse over here is composed of all of those elements, and he took it 1, 2, 3, 4 stages. Actually, when he was preparing for his television lessons, he did them in 9 or 10 stages as rehearsals to be sure that he understood exactly where he was going from each one. This is one of the finished drawings that was probably used on a television show. And down here is a very quick sketch that he made from life at a rodeo in Idlewild many years ago. These small sketches are all done, except for the scratchboard in the center, all done for television shows as practice pieces or as perhaps later reconstructions from those shows, and they again show the familiar scenes John was so well known for. This, of course, is New York City itself, the RCA building, I believe, in the background. And here we have very tiny little sketches done probably just as he was out on an expedition or a picnic, because they're just on scraps of paper. I think they're interesting because they're so spontaneous, and very early pieces, in fact, and very nicely done. Here we have a clipping from an early sketching set, which, as you can see, sold for $2.98. And up here, one of the very few pieces of fan mail I have, which is not a John Gnagy drawing. They were often sent to him, but in fact, a drawing of John Gnagy himself, sent by Dickie Schmidt. It's quite a good likeness, I think, considering that the young man was in fact supposed to be watching what Johnny was teaching him to draw and not the artist himself. I think that's charming. The etching you see on the far wall is not by John Gnagy, but by a fan of his who grew up to be a well-known professional artist. Michael Jacques sent this to my father, and at the same time it was published in an article about Michael Jacques in American Artist. It pleased Johnny very much to know how he had in fact influenced other painters and artists. And on this wall we have 2 pieces quite different from each other, but also among my favorites. Flight is a small lithograph of just of the motion of a rising flock of pigeons or doves. And it has been very popular because it's a sentimental but a really very lovely piece. Next to it, you see an early sketch, again, a watercolor ink done of the RCA building from Gnagy's studio on 57th Street. That's one that I had framed for this exhibit, and I think it's very nice. The oil painting on the wall of flowers is not at all typical of Gnagy, but it's interesting because it was used as a color demonstration before the FCC in 1950, when NBC and CBS were competing for the licensing rights. Therefore, he did a very quick painting with a palette knife with very bright colors in order to convince the FCC on closed-circuit television in Washington that, in fact, the NBC system was better. I might add that NBC was awarded the first license, and it pleased everyone very much. When I discovered that painting, by the way, I didn't think it was one of his, but one of his students, and nearly discarded it. It wasn't until I looked on the back and saw what John had written that I realized what it was. A little piece of history. The two rehearsal sketches you see next to the oil painting are typical scenes that he did in his television exhibits. They were rehearsal sketches because he did them over and over and over before he felt ready to do his live shows. And here we have the artist himself teaching, as he did so deftly, from beginning to end, a painting or a drawing.
I even darkened the inside of the boat a bit. And cutter one of these fibers. Darken the accent right at the waterline and in the top edge of the boat. Now there are many other things you can do, such as softening those reflections, or with a piece of cleansing tissue. I can soften them like this. Get more of that.
The last room of this very nice museum is devoted entirely to fish and fishing. And it pleases me very much because I'm not sure John himself realized how many pieces he had that were, again, in different media and of different sorts. But of course the stars, in my view, are those beautiful scratch boards that you see on the far wall. There are 5 of them here. Again, I had several of them framed for the first time, and they simply look wonderful. The 2 on the right were studies designed, I'm sure, for the fish illustrations. And they are incomplete, but they're beautiful, I believe. Those are tropical fish. I haven't looked up to see what kind, done in the brilliant colors in which those fish are arrayed in nature. I'm particularly interested as a new discovery in this scratch board here at the bottom. I think it has wonderful composition. As you can see, the fish is out of the composition. So you have the fish's point of view as though he were underwater. And then you move up into the small rectangle, and there you see the bottom of the boat, the fisherman himself reeling in this flounder or flatfish. And you might not be able to tell it, but in that net bag you have a number of beer cans, and those have an X on them, which I know indicated that they were made by Kruger Beer. Now, Kruger at one time was a sponsor of Johnny's when he was doing the weather and fishing show on Long Island. So whether he did that again for whimsy or whether he was planning to use it in some way with the Kruger Company, I don't really know, but it was a pleasure to discover that one. Up above you is one of the great scratch boards John ever did. It's unusually large for pieces like that, and again is a point of view underwater. You see the giant tuna are pursuing the bubbles made by the lure, which is a beer can. Again, this is part of the thing that Johnny was doing at that time. He was enjoying working by playing, or enjoying playing by calling it work. Being sponsored by Kruger Beer, he would go out on fishing expeditions, come back and talk about what they had caught, and give the weather incidentally. And while he was doing that, of course, lots of beer was probably consumed, as it is on fishing expeditions, and he discovered that maybe if you put holes in both ends of the beer cans after they were empty, you could create a lure that would bring in the fish. You might also be interested in knowing that the back end of the little fishing skiff, which in fact is at the lower left of this composition, has the name John on it. He put himself into his paintings in lots of different ways. The blackfish is there, hooked on a line you can hardly see. The line itself is in fact hooked around that piece of coral. And he looks pretty baleful. If I didn't know better, I would think that perhaps John had put some expression on that fish because he knew the fish wasn't happy at being caught. The truth is, that's how tautogs, or blackfish, really look. They're rather ugly creatures, but John certainly made this one into a gorgeous composition. These three green sunfish are all from the same parent, as it were. The bottom one is the original scratch board. The two above are framed together because you see the copper plate has made a print. There were a few proofs made of some of these copper plates, and I found that this one could be framed so that all three were visible. Just for sentiment and affection, I brought in John's old fishing creel, which I remember well from childhood because he and I used to go out on early morning fishing expeditions very often. The first day of trout season is one that I remember especially. And the tuna fish with its copper plate was anatomically correct and ready for an illustration in the fishing guide. This is one of my sentimental favorites because I remember that fishing expedition. I was only 7 or 8 years old, and it was all that Johnny caught, so he named that little painting Day's Catch. It's a small golden sunfish lying on a bed of reeds where he put it on the porch when he came home, and there is the edge of his fishing creel. This painting was done in gouache also, a kind of tempera paint, very quickly and very well, I think. It's a great favorite of mine. Undersea Reef Garden is also gouache, but it's a very soft painting done on soft paper, so its effect is quite different. And it has that interesting underwater point of view which fascinated John so often, and that slightly green cast to it, which water does with sunlight coming through. Now that we've finished looking at the world of John Gnagy, I'd like to come in and view for a moment the world of Jerry Shep. I talked about Jerry earlier as being the director of Maitland Art Center and a very nice friend, and I would just like to have a moment with him about the exhibit because he's been so important to it. Jerry, I want personally now to thank you for your help on getting this exhibit together, your encouragement and your guidance, and the beautiful way in which it's hung. I hope it's given you as much pleasure as it has me.
Yes. My treat for all of the work that I do here is being able to hang the exhibits and to enjoy them. I've also found that this particular exhibit has been a great deal of fun because of the number of people who come in and said, John Gnagy, oh, I remember Saturday mornings I'd get up and I would sit down and watch him on TV and draw. He's the one that got me going. Our architect, Leslie Dieball, was one who mentioned that was where she first learned to draw, and I've had several other friends that, you don't realize how many people are involved and how small the world really is, because all of a sudden you've got all these people that you never knew had that much contact with John Gnagy or had that much important, he was that important to them.
I didn't know it either, so it's been a great gratification for me because I know how much it would please my father. It might surprise him a little bit, but I don't think he would be amazed because I think he felt as though he really were teaching people who enjoyed both painting and learning, and some of those were inevitably going to grow up and work in the arts.
Yes.
But they do speak so kindly of him, so enthusiastically, that I believe more and more that his teaching was very valid.
Yes.
That's a pleasure for me to discover.
And it's very nice to be able to see the mixture of work that he did as well.
Yes.
The fine art, the quick sketches, the class lessons type of thing, a little bit of everything, and then the illustrations that he did for magazines and his experimentation.
Well, you were the one who helped me realize what versatility and proficiency he really had. I think I was a little timid about the quality of the painting because, in fact, when you're that close to it, you don't know. I knew there were 5 or 6 or 7 of my favorites, but I really couldn't tell what the world would judge them by. And it's been a great pleasure for me to see them together. You hung the show beautifully and with a great sensitivity to those various media he enjoyed working in.
Well, and I'm leaving tomorrow for Tallahassee and going up for Arts Day, and I'm taking one of the Gnagy posters and one of the Avery posters up that we're donating to the Division of Cultural Affairs to hang in the old Capitol building, where they hang posters of various organizations. So hopefully tomorrow evening, John may be hanging in the Capitol.
I saw those last year up there. That's a very nice little gallery and a nice way to have Maitland represented and
Yes.
invited. That's great.
Well, it's good for us, and it's also good that people will get to see that little Maitland is able to attract quality as well.
Well, it's been a good project from start to finish, and although I had a few anxieties along the way, I had many reassurances, and now an awful lot of pleasure. Thank you so much, Jerry.
Thank you for allowing us to exhibit the works.
Well, my pleasure.